Greetings and salutations. So, in her Literature and Knowledge, Catherine Wilson is talking about the doctrine of aesthetic cognitivism. She writes, there's probably no subject in the philosophy of art which has prompted more impassioned theorizing than the question of the cognitive value of works of art. And she notes that one influential critic wrote, in the end, I do not distinguish between science and art except as regards method. Both provide us with a view of reality, and both are indispensable to a complete understanding of the universe. So again, let's revisit these concepts, or this concept. Aesthetic cognitivism is the doctrine that human beings learn things from art, right? We learn primarily ethical and psychological truths, but we may learn other truths as well from art. Um, as Wilson takes pain to note, aesthetic cognitivism is, to put it mildly, controversial. Um, she notes that there are anti-cognitivists who just dismiss it out of hand. She quotes a philosopher, I.A. Richardson, who states that poetry consists of pseudo statements which are true if they suit and serve some attitude or link together attitudes which on other grounds are desirable, but that there's no cognitive content to it. And this, of course, goes back to the critique of the value of ethical statements made by the logical positivists of the 1930s, right? So Wilson, her view is very much a moderate view in this debate. She's neither wholly for aesthetic cognitivism nor against it, although in the end she does advance a qualified view, right, in which aesthetic cognitivism can be regarded as contributing to human knowledge acquisition. So she tells us about this. This is page 324 of the text. The view I should like ultimately to defend should be viewed as an alternative to one which has found much favor among partisans of the cognitive value of literature, namely the view that literary works contain or imply propositions which the reader is led to accept. The proposition theory, as I call it, is thoroughly indefensible for a number of reasons, right? So again, here she's arguing against a view that's anti aesthetic cognitivism, right? So she calls again this view the proposition theory. And what are the doctrines of the proposition theory? Well, she notes that proposition theorists, right, they deny almost categorically any suggestion, right, that we can gain any knowledge from art, right? So, for example, here on page 325, right, what they wish to argue was that propositions like those listed above, and like, for example, what these are, what these propositions she's referencing are claims like there are no essences to our emotions, right? In a humanity state after the fall from the Garden of Eden, right? It's much better, and that we have free will in a sense which we lacked before, right? But against this view, right, Morris White's claims that no sociologist and no philosopher could, in principle, establish this conclusion because of the inherent limitations of science, sociology, and philosophy as disciplines. And one is left wondering what sort of truth it is which is established neither by empirical observation nor by reasoning from a set of established or immediately plausible assumptions. If, on the other hand, White's means that Richard Wright has already anticipated what sociology or philosophy can, and so eventually will reveal, one is justified in wondering what the difference is between anticipation of this sort and mere conjecture. Whichever way his claim is interpreted, it plays directly into the hands of his skeptical opponent. So there, she notes some of the difficulties for the aesthetic cognitivist, right? What can it mean to have knowledge if you're not deriving it from empirical or logical sources, right? However, she notes that there are two further objections to the proposition theory. First of all, even if it were true that Milton, Proust, Eliot, and Shakespeare all believed themselves to have valid sociological or philosophical demonstrations of the propositions their works may be read as implying, this would not provide the reader with any reason for belief. No matter how broad the presumed experience of humanity, they cannot be supposed to speak with any particular authority. And secondly, if what one learned from literature were that the propositions which are contained in particular works And secondly, if what one learned from literature were the propositions which are contained in particular works, a wider acquaintance with literature would paradoxically result in a constriction of knowledge, since for many literary works, a work can be found which implies the opposite. So from there, she moves on to consider the work of a influential cognitivist, a woman named Dorothy Walsh, right? Uh, and Walsh talks about a common, a widely held philosophical distinction, right? Knowing that and knowing how. So to illustrate, right, a person may be said not only to know, for example, how to play chess or ride a bicycle, and that, for example, the War of the Roses began in 1456, but also what it is like. And this is Walsh's unique contribution to this literature, right? Knowing what it is like. So, for her example, right, or some of her examples, uh, we know what it is like to suddenly fall in love, to lose a child to death, or undergo religious conversion, right? According to Walsh, knowing what rounds out the complete picture of knowledge. So we have knowing that, knowing how, and knowing what on Walsh's view, right? And it is knowledge of this sort, the knowing what, right, that literature provides. In the course of reading a novel, a person may acquire knowledge in the form of realization, the realization of what anything might come to as a form of lived experience, right? Um, Now, as you might expect, right, Wilson's got her own critiques of that view, right? She tells us a person may learn from a novel, I want to argue, if he is forced to revise or modify, for example, his concept of reasonable action through recognition of an alternative as presented in the novel. Such a view can account for the impression of writers like White's that particular works can reveal such things as that the only freedom left in the world is the freedom to destroy yourself. But to insist that what has been learned here is that a certain statement is true is to truncate, in a radically unacceptable way, the more complex process. I want now to argue briefly that the term learning applies primarily to a modification of a person's concepts, which is in turn, capable of altering his thought or conduct, and not primarily to an increased disposition to utter factually correct statements or to display technical prowess. All right. Learning on her view, on Wilson's view, means you change your concept, you change your fundamental orientation vis-a-vis some aspect of the world, right? And she thinks that is ultimately possible through art. In the very last paragraph of her article, she tells us there's a very good deal that remains to be filled in the above account. Notably, the very idea of a person possessing a concept of honor, kindness, reasonableness, or even of causal influence. Nevertheless, it suggests one way of preserving the insights of both proposition theorists and their emotivist opponents without reproducing their incoherencies. A kind of understanding which literature affords cannot be represented as a body of statements occupying a particular location in a nexus of historical and scientific doctrine. But as I try to show, by knowledge we do not mean that body of doctrine. Again, knowledge, ultimately for Wilson, again, is a change in your conceptual orientation, your conceptual outlook on the world. And she thinks that we can learn how to do this through literature.